Hey folks, what's up? It's Evan from Stock Music Musician, and today I want to teach you how to EQ your snare. This is probably one of the most important instruments in your entire mix to get right. And after you're done with this tutorial, you'll understand the exact framework for how to EQ snare so that it'll sound just like what you need it to do for your mix. Sometimes you need your snare to be big and punchy. Sometimes you need it to be light and airy, or tight and ringy. There's a million different snare sounds, and it's really important that you get your EQ choices right so that you can make your snares sound perfect. In case you ever forget what you're trying to do, I have a series of EQ cheat sheets that you can download. I'll put a link below. Go click on that, and that'll get you everything you need to know about snare EQ as a reference. So if you say, oh, my snare is too boxy, you'll know exactly where to cut because that'll show you on the cheat sheet. So let's take a listen to this snare right here. This song's pretty simple, but I like the snare sound a lot on it. It is, I think, just what the song kind of needs. It's got an old school, like kind of sampled hip hop vibe to it, and a snare that just kind of punches through with a lot of air and a lot of movement. So let's listen. Let's just say the drum bass. So to me, that's just the right amount of like crack to the snare on the upper end, but it also has a little bit of body that sits there. And so there's a few things that we do to achieve this. You're not only going to learn what the EQ moves are, but kind of where I place the EQ in my processing between compression and other things, as well as some other techniques that you use to shape the sound of your snare, because you shouldn't do it all with EQ. EQ is a tool for shaping and sculpting your snare tone, but there's other tools that you should also use, and when they all work together perfectly, that's how you'll get the best snare sound. So let's listen to everything bypassed, or the snare bypassed, and I'm going to bypass, I'm using some parallel compression on the drums as well, so I'm going to bypass that, and let's listen to what it sounds like now. Turn the parallel compression back on. Off. Parallel compression itself is used to add a little bit of tone and grit and richness, but a lot of the tone and lift and grit richness is coming from the EQ and some other processing on the snare. So let's turn that on now. We'll first listen to it with it off and then on. Off. That just sounds so much better to me. It sits way more in the mix. It's got way more of that just high energy feeling without being sharp and piercing. So here's the workflow for your snare. This is how you want to conceptualize it. First, any tone shaping up front. I'm using a tape saturation plugin. And by the way, I'll have affiliate links down below to all these plugins. Well, links down below to all these plugins. They're not all affiliate plugins, but these are just plugins I like and use for my mixes. The UAD plugins, you need to have a UAD hardware to work, but there's a lot of other good tape emulations out there. So I'm using the tape plugin for some saturation, for some compression, but I'm also doing some tone shaping with it. There's high frequency and low frequency filters on the tape presets or on the tape emulations, and so you can actually tweak tone broadly by using the tone of the tape that you're using. I'm also using a fast tape, which is going to be brighter. Let's just listen to the difference between 30 IPS and 7.5 IPS. So you can see how there's a lot of tone shaping going in. That is kind of like EQ. Dull. Now bright. So think about your move sort of like that you're dialing in the tone slowly but surely. You're not wanting to do massive moves on any part of your snare. And I guess before I go even farther, I should say the most important thing to do is to choose a good snare sound. If you've got the wrong snare sound, all the EQ in the world is not going to fix it. So get the right snare sound first. Think, do you need body? Do you need air? Do you need punch? Whatever that feeling you need of the snare, get that by the sound choice. And then we're just using EQ and these processing tools to enhance that sound. Another thing to consider, especially if you're using the snare samples, is whether or not you need to pitch the tone of the snare up or down. It really can make a huge difference. This sample works for me just the way it is, but we'll experiment with pitching it up and down just so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. So I've got it selected here, and this is the pitch wheel. We'll start lower. We'll start like 7 semitones lower, middle, and then higher. So all of those tones are usable would be usable for different songs. You just need to find the right one for your song. So let's listen in the context of the whole mix. You're going to be wanting to do most of this without the drums soloed. So now we're going to stop soloing the drums. And as we get into the EQ parts. So let's just listen with the pitch. To me, right around -10 sounds the best. It's full, but it's also airy. So let's leave it there. And so again, like this is not exactly EQ. I'm going to show you the exact EQ moves I've done. But so many people think that, it's like the saying, if you give a man a hammer, he's going to try and hammer everything. That's not how the saying goes, but whatever. If all you have, if you call whatever, the saying. If you only think that you solve solutions with EQ, you're wrong. There are much better tools for tone shaping broadly, and then we're going to use EQ to help enhance what we've got. So the first EQ plugin I have in after the tape plugin is the FabFilter Pro Q3, which is a very precise digital style EQ, and I'm just using this to remove some of the resonances in the snare and some of the low end, which we don't need, so that we can have more space for the bass and the kick to be there. So we'll turn this on and off, and then we'll kind of look at what's going on here. So let's just listen to it first, bypassed, and then I'll turn it on. And this may not be super noticeable. We're just going to solo the snare for now. I recommend not doing that when you're doing most of the EQing, but when it comes to subtractive EQ, which is always sort of the first thing I do after tone shaping, it can be okay to listen in solo because you're just trying to remove the parts of the snare that sound the worst. So looking for these resonances, these ringing parts, and then the parts that might interfere with other important instruments. So this is with it off. And so you notice one is on this big bump right here, but what we'll do instead is we'll boost these just so you can hear. You hear how boxy that is? Because on this, I don't want this song doesn't need low end on the snare. It needs body. It needs air. It needs to like kind of be up there. We'll boost a few of the other frequencies now that we've brought the whole mix back. Hear how honky that is? frequency on the snare that I was hearing now, a little bit of a ringing that we'll listen to, and I'll show you how we find it. So let's hit play. We've soloed the snare. You hear it's kind of a almost. So what I'm going to do is narrow the Q, boost the frequency, and we're just going to sweep until we hear it. To me, it sounds like it's right around here. So we'll just remove that because that's a little whistly. And I'm fine with this now. Let's turn it off one more time just so we can hear what we've done. And it's just a little cleaner. Now we run it into a compressor. I know that's not part of the EQ, but I like to take away the stuff before I do a compressor, and then I will do another EQ at the end to add some more stuff. And this is a characterful compressor. It's adding a lot of warmth and a little bit of tightness. Pretty fast attack, medium release. So that's really just there to control it a little bit. It's not that extreme because there's not an extreme dynamic range in this snare. It's pretty much going right along. So we tone shape, we cut out the bad frequencies, we compress so that we're only compressing the good frequencies, and then we enhance so we're not freaking out the compressor. And here I'm using a tube style EQ. This Summit Audio EQ by Softtube is great. Also their Pultic Emulation is fantastic. Just something that's sort of broad and tubey is what I'm looking for here to get a little more harmonic saturation and a little more, just a little more air is what I was seeking to get on this plugin. So you'll see there's 4 bands here. A low band, which I have no gain on. A medium band, which I have no gain on. But then this high band where I'm boosting around 2.2, I'm boosting quite a bit, and then also around 3.3 I'm boosting quite a bit. But these are fairly wide cuts. This has got a very wide cut, and then this is actually a shelf boost. So let's listen on and off. And then I've also gained it down so that we're not doing any, basically we're gain staging it properly. So I'm going to turn it off, and then we'll turn it on. And so you can just hear it pop out of the speakers and come way more to life. The point, there's not really any right way to do this additive EQ with the snare. It's whatever your song needs. It's whatever your song calls for the snare to fill in on the frequency space. For me, I need this snare to be kind of noisy, like almost like a white noise, wide and high to fill in that space because everything else is kind of filtered down and wobbly and washed out. So I want this snare to be bright, and that's why I've boosted these low highs, these high mids, I guess. And so we'll just look at each one of these now. We'll take them out and put them in one at a time. And if you download that frequency chart, like I said, I've got that whole, not just cheat sheets for snare, but for kick, for bass, for, guitar, a bunch of different cheat sheets for instruments. You will see, if you want air, boost this range. If you want body, boost this range. It's totally, there are plenty of times when you want to boost your snare at 500 or something. That's just not what this song needs. What you need to do for your boosts is, what does this song need? That's always what you want to be thinking about. What frequency ranges aren't full enough? What is the role of the snare? So I'm adding kind of a precise ish round curve around 2.2, and then a shelf at 3.3 to really bring out more on this. So let's first listen to the peak, although these are fairly warm, around. And now let's do the high shelf. You hear that? Or maybe that's and so I'm just trying to bring out that high end a little bit so that the snare sits there and has this whole space to itself. I also almost certainly have a little bit of EQ. Again, I run all the drums through a drum bus, and it's the same process all over again. I use a tone shaping tape plugin. I'm going to use a digital EQ to take out the bad frequencies of the drum set as a whole, because first we're taking out the individual bad things, but then when you have multiple instruments playing at the same time, that might create a build up because, 1 + 1 = 2, and 2 is too much. Now, 1 was fine by itself, and 1 was fine by itself, but when you bring them together, it's too much because maybe it's getting in the way of the bass or the piano combined. So I use the Subtractive EQ, run it through the excellent Waves API 2500 drum compressor. Then I'm using the UAD Pultec, but there's a great soft tube emulation of the Emulation. The Tube Tech compressor series is great. Again, I'm just using this for some additive EQ. I'm doing some imaging to make the drums a little wider and narrower. And then I'm running it through a clipper to get a little more level out of it and a little more control the dynamic range. But the main thing, again, is it's just the same process. Tone shape, subtractive EQ, compress, additive EQ, adding in what your song needs. There's also parallel compression, which is basically, I'm only using one of these compressors here. It's for another tutorial that they're all loaded up, but this is just adding some grit. So listen to this on and off. Actually, we'll see what this sounds like. You hear how that's like melted and distorted? Especially on the kick, but also on the snare. I'll just bring up the volume. So you can use compression to tone shape. There are a million ways to tone shape, from distortion to everything else. The art of using EQ is really to make everything, first to take out all the bad stuff, then to make everything play well with each other, and then to enhance so each instrument can occupy its own space. But there are multiple tools you can use for each stage that are related to EQ, and hopefully this kind of gives you an idea not only of how to EQ your snare, but how EQing your snare relates to other processes. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and be sure to download that snare cheat sheet. Bye.